Hi there. Today's lesson 3, is going to add a few additional rhetorical concepts to your tool bag. Lesson 1 went over the rhetorical triangle, audience, speaker, and purpose. Lesson 2 went over the 3 appeals, ethos, logos, and pathos. And today I want to talk about 3 additional small concepts that will help you in doing rhetorical analyses. Those are, first, angle of vision or audience assumptions. Secondly, something I would call the main principle of an argument. And finally, explicit versus implicit arguments. Okay, let's start with angle of vision. Let's look at this pair of images by William Hogarth, a artist drawing or engraving images for public consumption in England back in the 18th century, the late 1700s. Here's a diptych, or a pair, 2 images that were meant to be looked at side by side. One is called Gin Lane, and the other is called Beer Street. Let's look at Gin Lane for a second and ask ourselves what's going on in this image. We can use the 3 appeals to start analyzing it rhetorically. You see here lots of, shall we say, negative or terrible things happening. There's suffering in this world. In Gin Lane, there are people dropping their children, their babies. It looks like very viscerally in the front, a mother is dropping her baby. People's possessions are being dismantled. There's on the left side, a person pawning off part of his overcoat, and there's buildings falling over. And if you look carefully, you see that people look drunk. There are some cups, some bottles, and from the title of the picture, you quickly put together the assumption that people on this street are too drunk to care about keeping their lives together. Things are falling apart at the seams, and there's death and destruction in this world. Comparatively, look at Beer Street. Here are people looking happy and healthy. There are buildings that look straight and well and have integrity. New buildings are going up under some nice looking construction in the background. A gentleman is posting a very appealing looking piece of art in the street. People are sitting around a table looking happy. These emotional appeals evoked by these happy people and the sort of implicit logic of this image is saying the opposite of Beer Lane, of Gin Lane, that on Beer Street people are happy and healthy. Okay, so together these images seem to be arguing that gin is bad and beer is good. Just to give a little more historical background, Hogarth was commissioned by the British Parliament to try to help promote beer as the beverage of choice for the middle and lower class, because at the time a lot of gin was being imported and it was cheaper, and for the lower class who could barely afford to keep a roof over their heads and so on, gin was suddenly a very accessible, cheap way of kind of escaping from your troubles, drowning your worries in alcohol. And so there was a concern that the lower class would make things worse for themselves by becoming alcoholic, being addicted to gin. So to replace that, the Parliament said, let's try to promote beer. And one of the reasons is for health, because it's a little more difficult to get drunk on beer, because it's more filling. But secondly, to go a little more political, beer was a domestically produced product. England made beer, so by buying beer, it helped the British economy. So it's a little bit more complicated than just health. But the image that Hogarth created makes an argument primarily for health. If you drink beer, you'll be happier and healthier. If you drink gin, you're going to look like one of these people, very disheveled. Okay, so angle of vision. What do we mean by angle of vision? Well, the angle of vision is the assumptions, the cultural values or assumptions that an audience is bringing to a rhetorical situation. So if the audience in Hogarth's diptych is the British middle and lower class, the question is, what assumptions is that audience going to hold that Hogarth can tap into to try to be more persuasive in his text? So in this case, it's pretty straightforward. The underlying assumption here is something like being happy and healthy is good. You want to have health and happiness in life and success, and you don't want to have death and suffering and destruction. This is a basic underlying assumption that most people will agree with. But it is an assumption that a reader or a viewer of these pictures would have to agree with for this argument to make sense. If for some odd reason you have an oddball viewer who looks at these images and says, well, that's great. I want gin even more because I love to be suffering and decaying and everything around me falling apart. If someone actually wanted that for some odd reason, then Hogarth's mission would be thwarted. It would have the opposite effect, right? So the underlying assumption plays a key role. Let's look at that Budweiser commercial, Brewed the Hard Way, from Lesson 1. You can pause and rewatch that commercial if you'd like, or you may remember enough of it to keep going, but just pause if you need to review it. If you remember, that commercial had an underlying argument, something like, you should drink our beer because several reasons. Some of the most important ones were A, it's really American, it's high quality, it's Beechwood aged, so it's going to taste good. And then C, this is the interesting one for today's purposes, it's, quote, not a sipping beer. It's not a crafty, slowly brewed, small batch brewed beer. There might be even a reference in there to something like a spiced pumpkin latte beer or something like this. And this was the underlying logical difference that this commercial was trying to draw. This was a Super Bowl commercial from last year's Super Bowl, 2015, and in 2015, this is coming after about a decade of a huge shift in the beer industry away from macro brews or large company brewing like Budweiser and Miller Lite and all those companies towards an interest in small house brewed craft beers, highly sophisticated, more complex tasting beers. And this commercial was specifically targeting that trend and trying to capture some of the beer drinkers back to the more traditional macro brew. And it was doing that by trying to differentiate themselves from those small craft brews. And saying, we're American, we are high quality, and it's not sipping. All right, so will this commercial work? Is this a good strategy, an attempt to accomplish what they wanted? Well, it depends on the underlying assumption of the audience. Is that audience going to is it going to resonate to want to be distant and different than the people who want to sip on beers, or do they want to be more like the people who sip on craft beers? Who are they like? If you want to go deeper, it's not just about, do you like to sip on your tasty beers, or do you like to sort of swing back blander beers, lighter beers? There's actually, if you want to look at it even more in more detail, there's a kind of a whole cultural value system or a whole cultural outlook that goes with the kinds of people who prefer craft beers that you slowly enjoy, that have more taste, versus the people who want cheaper, blander tasting beers and drink more of it, and maybe a little more hard partying, a little more traditional. And if you want to be seeing yourself, it depends on how you want to see yourself. Do you want to believe that you're more of the former or more of the latter? More of the hipster who drinks craft beers, or more of the laid back, or I should say, like traditional masculine, hardworking industrial worker person who drinks cheap beers? It really depends which depends on which one you go with, right? So in fact, this commercial had a largely flopped. It kind of backfired. There was a backlash on the internet because a lot of people felt alienated by this commercial because they liked craftier beers, or at least they wanted to think of themselves as liking craftier beers and the kind of cultural trends towards small, careful brewing that the kind of cultural values that go along with that trend. So it maybe Budweiser misjudged the angle of vision or the underlying assumption of their audience. It kind of makes sense that Budweiser would assume that an audience of viewers watching the Super Bowl would be likely to be sympathetic to a kind of harder-edged vision of what beer should be and what culture should be. But I guess maybe hipsters like to watch the Super Bowl too. Okay, so that's the angle of vision, and if you miscalculate the audience's underlying assumption or angle of vision, you're likely to make the wrong strategic decisions when it comes to crafting your text. Maybe that's what Budweiser did here. Okay, second part, the main principle of an argument. So this is what I would call the main principle of the argument is almost the same thing as saying what the main underlying assumption is. The main principle is often unspoken or implied. It's not stated explicitly, and it's often a value statement or an assumption about the values that an audience has. A very simple version of this is to think about a formulaic sentence, something like something, fill in the blank, is good, or it is good to blank. And that is not said directly often in the text. It's inferred or implied in the text. But that main principle is driving the argument of the text. So like we just said with the angle of vision, in Hogarth, you've got to agree that being happy and healthy is desirable. Happy and healthy is good. Conversely, death and suffering are bad. That's the main principle underlying that argument. And then in the Budweiser commercial, you've got to agree that being tough, manly, and traditional is good, and conversely, being artistic or maybe even slightly effeminate, as hipsters are sometimes thought to be, is bad. And if you don't agree with that underlying assumption or that main principle, then the argument kind of falls down. So underlying assumption, main principle, very similar, just pointing out that if you can identify a really strong, important, value-based assumption, that might be very key, and we can call that the main principle. Okay, last point, explicit versus implicit arguments. So a lot of different types of rhetorical texts use what's called an explicit argument. They will state explicitly, directly, right in the text itself, what the purpose of the text is, what the writer wants to accomplish in the text. In academic writing, this is called a thesis statement. And you see things like thesis statements in a lot of different kinds of writing and text creating. One might be, for example, letters to the editor, an opinion piece arguing for a specific viewpoint. Here's an example from a letter to the editor by a gentleman named David Rockwood, and he opens his letter stating very explicitly what he wants to accomplish in the letter. There are several basic reasons why wind-generated power can in no way serve as a reasonable major alternative to other electrical supply alternatives for the Pacific Northwest power system. All right, there are several basic reasons why. Everything after that is basically his bottom line purpose, and the rest of his letter, if we were to go on to read it, just outlines those several basic reasons. Very simple. It explicitly states the purpose. However, most things we encounter on a day-to-day level, most rhetorical texts and situations don't state explicitly what the purpose is. Rather, there is an implicit or indirect way of arguing. Take Hogarth, for instance. There's no thesis statement in this pair of images. In fact, it's in the images themselves that the argument is. It's more precisely in our comparing of the two images that the argument arises. Viewers automatically compare and contrast these two scenes and draw their own conclusions about what they mean. And most regular viewers will say, wow, beer will make me much happier than gin, based on the argument made in these two images. But that's implicit. There's no explicit statement of that anywhere in these pictures. Similarly, in the Budweiser commercial, like most commercials, there's not an explicit statement of what they're trying to get you to do. It's inferred. Hardly any commercial will ever state explicitly, we want you to buy our product. So this commercial does not state you should drink Budweiser because it is serious, American, and made with care. It doesn't say that. Instead, it tries to show that through images, words, and ideas. It tries to suggest that. Well, magazine articles of the type we've been reading so far in this course are like this too. They often don't state explicitly what their purpose is. They instead have an implicit argument. Nowhere in the article Splurge and Purge, for instance, do we find a direct call or request for us to boycott fast fashion companies. But the writer gives some pretty strong reasons for us to think twice before we start buying clothes from Forever 21, right? So by showing us things that are happening in that world, the implicit argument is made. You shouldn't probably buy clothes from fast fashion companies. Notice the power of implicit arguments. This is something commercials tapped into right away after the creation of television, and something that Hogarth was doing even back in the 1700s. It's more powerful to draw your own conclusion as a reader of a text or a viewer than to have it handed to you explicitly. Why? Because it makes us feel smart to have figured out with our own creative powers and logical reasoning powers what the message is. It makes us feel smarter. So implicit arguments are often what you will see because they're more powerful. That being said, if it's an academic paper and you are asked to explicitly state your argument, or that's what the convention tells you to do, in a thesis statement, for instance, then so be it. Okay, those are the three principles, rhetorical principles or tools I want you to take from today: angle of vision, the main principle of an argument, and the explicit versus implicit form of arguments. And on today's discussion thread, I want you to think about the articles that we read for today from Nautilus. I'm going to ask you to identify some of the main points in one of the articles, what you thought the main point of the article was. But I'm also interested, as we discuss, I'm also interested in the particular theme or how the theme of this article of Nautilus is how it works. All the articles for today and tomorrow from Nautilus are part of a issue of the magazine called Slow. That's the name of the magazine. They gave it a special title, Slow. It's the theme of the magazine. But what is Slow? The opening article by the editor, just called Slow, kind of tells us a little bit about what this is. He puts it in the context of the recent cultural trend toward doing things more slowly. Some people call it the slow movement. So that gives you a little context. But we want to think about, as we discuss these articles, what slow means, what patterns or recurring ideas are we seeing between these articles that together allow an idea or a worldview or a value system of what slow is to kind of emerge as we read through one article after another. Okay, I'll look forward to seeing what you think in the discussion page, and we'll continue the discussion of the slow movement tomorrow as we read Nautilus as well. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in Canvas.